My name is Dan Caramore. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Enside. Today, I'll be acting as your moderator. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you for everyone for joining. It's really appreciated that you're here to be innovative and collaborative as we talk through how to increase forecasting accuracy today. For those of you that may not know, Enside just celebrated its 25th birthday. For 25 years, we've been doing everything possible to help our clients and partners make better decisions and be more efficient. In life sciences specifically, we've really worked hard to be as innovative as possible to execute our trials more efficiently. Over the duration of these 25 years, we really help our customers, whether it's through advanced mathematics, AI, or recommendations based on studies that we work on to make sure that their trials are as optimal as they can be. Part of that piece of the puzzle is forecasting accuracy, and that's what we're really focusing on today. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our speakers, Audrey Tisson and Thomas Haccardio. With nearly a decade of combined experience in optimizing clinical trials and moving from consulting roles over to our software implementation team, they have a fantastic grasp on how to actually take better decisions in hypothetical situations in theory and implement those day to day in real time for your actual roles as clinical supply managers and as we're trying to optimize our clinical supply chains. With that being said, I'll pass over to Audrey and she'll introduce our agenda for today's webinar.
Hi everyone, and nice to meet you and welcome to this webinar. Very happy to see you here and thanks for participating to this session here today. So as Dan mentioned, indeed, that's really important for you to come out from this webinar with nice tips and tricks and concrete tools to better understand what's behind the forecast accuracy. So we want to know how to apply this accuracy and how to make sure you increase that forecast accuracy. You know that there are many challenges around this topic. So you will see that here we will be switching between theory and real life examples that we've consistently observed working with pharma companies in the past. So, you know, Thomas and myself were consultants for many years before joining the user engagement team. So I guess now it's the time to spread the knowledge and share some tips and tricks that you can take home with you. Perfect. So in terms of agenda, what's we will be looking at? First, we will look at the drivers of inefficiencies in a more global view and see what's the weight of forecast inaccuracy within these drivers. So we will deep dive and dig into the roots that makes forecasts inaccurate sometimes. Then we also want to have a look at the data collection. So what are the different assumptions that are necessary for an accurate forecast and where to find it? And most importantly, how easy it is to find it. So you will see we have some insights there and we will ask your insights as well. And it's one thing to get the right data, it's another one to use it properly. So that's why here within this webinar, we really want to cover a few and the common examples of pitfalls that we've seen in the past and the overlooked assumptions that we've seen through all the years of experience we had at Enside working in optimizing clinical trials. And I assure you that we've seen a lot of things happening in regards to the data usage. So now we want to share the examples and make sure you can take some key message here from the real business case that we can provide here. And the last step will be looking at the forecasting methodologies, because it's one thing to have the right data. And again, we need a tool to use this data and forecast it properly. And you will see that there are different types of tools, and we will help you understanding when and what tool do you use for different situations. So this will be a good way to wrap things up here. And we will also make sure to take the time to answer all the questions that could come up in the chat. As Dan mentioned, please shoot whenever you want, depending on what we will be displaying here. Shoot your questions, and we will take the time at the end of the webinar to answer these. If we don't have the time, that's perfectly fine. We can definitely follow up by email, or just it's another opportunity to meet again. Great. And we'll start with a small warm-up. As I can say here, we will be looking all at the chat. And I have a first question for you. According to your experience and to your role in the clinical trial industry, what do you think are the main drivers of inefficiencies in clinical supply planning? So think and don't hesitate, don't be shy, it's anonymous. And we really want to gather all these insights to see basically if we are aligned with what we could find on our end. And there are plenty of things we can think of: life cycle of the trial, the way you manage it. Okay, so I see some answers coming in, indeed. Unreliable study assumption, that's the obvious one, indeed. That's part of the data inaccuracy. This is the start from everything else, so that's where we will see the forecast coming in. So if study assumptions are not reliable, indeed, that's one of the main drivers. Discrepancy between assumptions and actual data, that's indeed aligned with what we have currently. And looking above the assumptions, what could be the other drivers, do you think? It's just to give you a bit more pictures, but basically, this is what we've identified as at Enside as being the main drivers of inefficiencies in clinical supply planning, in terms of waste, in terms of risk. So this is how we categorize them. You see here the list of all the topics. And not surprisingly, we see that demand forecasting and planning is part of it. And it is representing quite a big portion as well. If you're interested in other topics like trial design or anything else, we have other workshops that are very interesting to dig into if you want to gain a bit more expertise in how to best design trials to be optimal as of day one. But here, indeed, we will be tackling the demand forecasting and planning and see how this would impact the trials in an efficient or inefficient way. And that's basically the question we want to answer today. How does the patient demand forecast and planning can either drive the inefficiencies and waste or prevent this topic? Because we mentioned a few examples here of poor planning, like misrepresenting the trial, the supply chain, as you mentioned here. Overly conservative demand, that's what we usually see as well in the main trials. Manual calculations when you're working in Excel, and you usually have to add overage on top of it to make sure everything is under control and not at risk. So all of these different types have an impact indeed on the forecast, and you will see that the keyword here will be data accuracy and the way we use it. So you will see we want to give some examples of way to use the same assumptions, making sure that you are following the most efficient approach so that you can have accurate forecast in the end. Great. So I will go back to this scheme a bit later in this presentation. Just wanted to give you a small introduction. That's usually what we observe when talking about clinical supply planning processes. So usually clinical supply manager will have to gather data from different stakeholders, from different sources. And from there, they will build the demand forecast that will be translated into supply needs and supply planning. And that's where you can see all the outputs on the right that have to be at some point monitored. You have to keep track on your trial and these forecasts. And at some point, you know that trials are quite volatile. Sometimes it's really hard to know in advance what will happen. So forecasting is definitely part of the process as well. And within this full picture, today we will be looking at the most important step, as you all mentioned here. This is the source for everything else. This is the main input, the assumptions that we will be using to forecast. And that's important. So how to best use these assumptions, considering that there are some challenge in gathering these assumptions indeed. We are reaching the second poll here, so that's even easier. You will see some options appearing on the poll section to the right. And the question is, we want to gather some insights on how easy is it for you to collect data in your organization. So feel free to go to the poll section and answer the option that suits your reality and see what is coming in here. Yes, so this is what we thought indeed, looking at different options. It can go from it is straightforward, we trust the quality, to it's really a struggle, a real challenge. And that's what I see appears the most here in the poll, and it's not surprising. And that's basically why we chose to focus on this topic today, looking at the data collection and its impact on forecast accuracy, because we've been receiving a lot of feedbacks from pharma partners about how challenging it is sometimes to collect assumptions. So all these questions here might sound familiar for some of you. So what is the relevant data? When to start the forecasting? Is my data accurate? So these are the questions we often get from clinical trial managers. And looking at the image here, that's usually the face they make once we are discussing assumptions. So indeed, in this context, we really want to give you the tools and tips and tricks to, even if it's quite challenging, you cannot have the full picture here. There are some ways to gain inefficiencies for your forecast accuracy. So that's what we will try to answer today. And here, I just wanted to share a few statistics with you that you will see is linked to the rest of the presentation. But as you can see here, looking at the numbers, on average, typically in the industry, the waste level is around 60% to 75% at the end of the trial. So that's huge. And that's usually twice more than what we are expecting at the start of the trial in the early stages. So that's indeed, looking at this, it's a huge inefficiency. And again, this is a globally recognized average throughout all the trials, all the indications and therapeutical areas. But now if we compare these numbers to an option where we would put more focus on data accuracy and robustness, and that's what we did together with pharma partners. And we could see that the waste is actually way lower in that sense. We can reach an average waste level of 28%, and that's what we found out in 24 throughout all the different studies we built together with pharma partners. And in that case, it is lower than what was initially estimated, or at least it is stable. So how do we maintain that? How can we make sure that the waste is not too big at the very end? There are many answers, and looking at the drivers of waste, you see that there are many ways to optimize things, but indeed, using the data and the assumptions in the right way is one of the most important steps. So it's really being smart in the way we will be capturing it in the forecasts. Again, this is what we will show you here in a minute.
Yeah, this is a great point, Audrey, and I think that it's important for us to recognize the challenges, whether it's a small biotech or large pharma, gathering these assumptions and using them in a good way, right, to have an accurate forecast is so important. And I can't echo enough of whether it's Enside or other forecasting tools or similar strategies, being innovative and using the data to be as accurate as possible is so important for us in clinical trials.
Yeah, thanks then for for the additional comment. Indeed, that's very meaningful. So now we are heading the second topic about data collection. So before reaching all the answers that you are all looking forward to see, we wanted to take a bit of time to look at the typical data that we recommend to gather for a good forecast and where to find it. So usually that's what we are retrieving for clinical trials to be built. So all these types of data, everything related to, you can see here, recruitment, treatment, network, production, IoT, everything that will impact the future demand. So it's a lot of data together. So we understand that it's challenging. And here we did the exercise of looking at the source, the typical and common sources from where you can find this data. So you see many stakeholders, a lot of different files together indeed, but yeah, that's the reality. And here we won't go too much into details, so feel free to take a screenshot here and we can follow up on that if that's something you're interested in. But the key message here that I would like to share is that indeed it seems overwhelming. It seems very hard to standardize and gather all this information, centralize the information. But in the end, from our observation from the past, we know that most of this data is actually available at the early stage. And that's where we see that, for example, data coming from IoT and CMOs, everything related to IoT and network, for example, are usually standard to the organization. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can find this back and ask CMOs and IoT for the information. Then, yes, everything related to the protocol, it's usually available and it's stick to the stone. We know that in reality, sometimes it can also vary and have some amendments, but this is something that is quite easy to retrieve. What is more tricky is everything related to recruitment and treatment, for example, that will have an impact on the demands, but that is very, very uncertain and hard to catch. And that's why here we also want to give some tips to understand, even if you don't have the full picture, to understand how to make your forecast as accurate as you can with the information you have. On top of that, you can definitely, and that's what we recommend, optimize different strategies, making sure that you use the right tools to have something strong in terms of IRT, packaging and depot shipments as well. And this is usually something that we add on top of these assumptions that we are gathering here. Great. And just to end on a quick note here that is quite important, the general belief is that with the right data and a good system, we get good forecasts. And here we just want to challenge this a bit because it's not that's true in the end. What matters the most is the usage of the data, the proper use of data. And I like the sentence that says that the biggest risk is the one you don't see. That's exactly it. And it's one of the most underestimated threats for forecast accuracy is to use the data in the wrong way and indeed use the system, but not take the most out of it. So indeed, it's important to keep in mind that as supply chain manager, we have to be smart in the way we will be building the forecasts. Even if we don't have the full information, there are ways to already get closer to reality. Great. I will let Thomas follow up on the pitfalls and good practice.
Thank you, Audrey. So indeed, in the previous slide, we saw in the equation that the first element was to have the right data, but now we need to explain what is finally the right data and an accurate data. Let's imagine that we want to generate this really nice graph with the cumulative patient demand. You will need to have an accuracy in terms of numbers. So the objective will be to get the right amount of drugs for the patients all along the trial. You want also to have an accuracy in terms of timing. So finally, when the patient will be there to take the drugs, so finally get the drugs at the right time. Sometimes more difficult to obtain, you have also the accuracy in locations. To get the drug at the right place, you need to know the number of patients that you will have for the different countries. So it means to have a clear country list and also some values that are accurate in terms of recruitment, for example. And finally, you also need to have a forecast that is quite robust, meaning, and we all know that for the different trials, it never goes as expected. So each time you will have some unexpected events, some variation compared to the assumptions. And so you want to be sure that your forecast is robust enough to be able to use it during a certain period of time. It can be short or long, but at the end, you don't want to have to make this forecast each day. So that's why you also need to have this kind of robustness. Now that we have the information about the accurate data, we will see in some examples that even if we are using this data, this accurate data, depending on the way we will use it, we will have a different impact on the different forecasts. So that's really important to use this data properly. We will show you different examples with Audrey. Please don't hesitate to react also in the chat if you have any question, if you are a little bit surprised about some results, and we will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to come back. So again, all along the presentation, you can clearly react in the chat as all the questions that you could have. Please don't hesitate. It will be also a good way to open the discussion at the end of the presentation. I now let Audrey present some situations, again, to show how to use some data.
Yep, thanks to indeed. That's a good notice. Please shoot all your questions that you have in mind. It's also meant for that, just having some interesting discussions at the end. Okay, so I hope you kept in mind the 4 different prerequisites to have accurate forecasts that just Thomas mentioned. So we need to consider the quantity, the timing, the location, and the robustness. And this is important. These 4 prerequisites, I will just go back to this through all the exams that will be showing you. And indeed, the objective will be to show you how one single piece of data can be captured different ways in the forecast methods. So let's take recruitment, for example. That's the easiest example. I'm pretty sure this will speak to all of you. So let's say we have a trial with 800 patients with a long duration recruitment period of 2.5 years. So these are the assumptions, and there are usually 2 ways to consider that assumptions. Either we go for a linear recruitment, so you probably work with enrollment rates that you will be applying month by month, or you can actually be a bit more detailed in the way you will be looking at the recruitment forecast and consider that indeed, usually when a study starts, all countries won't start at the same time, and we have different timelines for the site openings. And this will definitely impact the recruitment evolution and the speed of the recruitment. And that's what we can see here, basically in this example. We've seen this in the past a lot. So this is a forecasted demand, a cumulative forecasted demand that has been computed based on linear approach, linear recruitment. So you see you have the same amount of patients that are expected every month. And then if you are considering a more accurate forecast, you will see that they will look like an S-curve. And as I mentioned, you see that the recruitment evolution is slower at the beginning because countries won't start at the same time. And we typically see that they are sometimes slow to start recruiting in the trial. And then you see that it goes a bit faster after. So the problem if you're using a linear recruitment is that you might overestimate, in this case, the production that you will need in the short term. So you will miss that visualization of the waste that will be generated at the beginning of the trial if you're considering a linear recruitment. And on top of that, you might underestimate the needs in the longer term. So that's something to keep notes for the recruitment. If you want to be as accurate as you can, please consider all the other information if you have some. And again, we know that sometimes it's hard to get the assumptions, but there are some trends that we can observe in the past, and feel free to use that to better forecast and have something more robust. And if I take these prerequisites back, we would be reaching the exact same amount of kits to dispense for both cases. But with the linear forecasted demand, we won't have the timeline accuracy. And that's really important to get something accurate from the beginning. So that's one of the examples. Another one that is in the same, happening in the same logic is about the dropout rate. So it's kind of the similar problems, but here we've seen many cases where companies are starting a new oncological trial, and that's the first time, and they're used to the standard way of working with limited visits and lower dropout and linear dropout. But we know that in oncological trials, the reality is way different, because there the amount of visits is basically theoretically unlimited, and we keep going as long as we have patients in the study. So we had to find ways to forecast, of course, and you might also have been in the situation in the past where we have to work with averages. So in this case, for example, we had a study where the average expected treatment for a patient was 15 months. And there are two ways to consider that. And the simplified way to forecast this is just considering that basically all patients will go through these 15 months of treatment. And that's something we usually see within the trials we are involved in at Insight. Instead of just using a dropout per visit that is specific and that is such that the average treatment is 15 months, but there we consider that patient can drop before or stay longer. And this has its importance as well. So how to illustrate that? Here you see that's the main difference. If we are looking at all patients having the 15 months of treatment, we will be having, in this example, 100 active patients at every visit until month 15. And then that's it. We don't cover anything else. You see where I'm coming here. If you're looking at a more smarter way to consider the dropout and the dispensing here, you will see that if we consider an average treatment of 15 months, but we consider some patient dropping before, as you can see on the very first part of the graph, and after as well, it is way more precise, and it will allow you to avoid this unnecessary waste that you might come up with if you are looking at the simplified way of working. And most importantly, again, it's still in terms of timelines, you will see these demands appearing that you won't see if you were in the simplified way. And again, I just link it to the sentence I mentioned before, that you have the risk that you don't see, and that's the most underestimated threat. And that's a good example here. So again, quantity would be the exact same thing, but timelines are off here. And if we look at titration, this is even worse. Why is that worse? Because usually what we get from clinical operations in terms of titrations are rough estimation on the proportion we we are guessing to have for each of the doses. In this case, we have 3 doses. We might have X% on dose 1, Y% on dose 2, and Z% on dose 3. And that's it. They just use this proportion and compute the dispensing based on this. Whereas in reality, we know that it might become way more complex. I don't know if some of you just observed some up titrations and down titrations behavior in some of their studies, but indeed, that's the reality, and that's way more complex than just considering a fixed proportion per dose. So that's one of the pitfalls we could see. Sometimes we also see that clinics tend to consider more than 100% of the patients in the demand, so considering 50% on each dose, and add on top of that some overage. So you can see here that the inefficiencies are really, really obvious in that sense, but we know it's quite hard to get that data. But you can already help the forecast in a good way if you have the mindset of considering this titrations behavior at the very beginning. And that's what you can see here in a more visual way. If you're not considering titrations over time, it's like you're considering that patients are on each of these doses, and that's it. Here is a more accurate forecast, and this is what we observe in dose escalations, where we see that all patients start on low dose, and then they can start down titrating and up titrating. So looking at this, you can guess that indeed what will be the impact on the dispensing if you don't look for different behaviors in terms of titrations. You might underestimate the low dose demand in the short term. Why? Because here you see that you are also considering medium and high dose, and overestimate in the future because patient will titrate down and up, and you might come with less people on the low dose at the end. So that's, again, another example of inefficiency. And why did I say that it's worse? Because looking at the prerequisites, in terms of quantities, that's already a red flag, I would say, because if you are just over-considering all of this, this will drive waste. If you're not, if you're just considering proportions and you don't put enough weight on the low dose at the beginning, you might come up with risk. So that's, again, a good example of inefficiency that we could observe in our past interactions with pharma companies. And I have one last one, just for the sake of it, regarding weight distribution. I know that some of you might work on studies with that type of characteristic. And usually, when you do some forecasts, you're given with the average weight for a patient. So let's say in this case, it's 70 kilo. We will just consider that on average, all patients will be 70 kilo, and that's good enough. And sometimes it's good enough. But you know that in reality, you will have some distribution. You will have some patients being under 70 or above 70. And in some cases, we know that it's hard to get the information, but we can always take assumptions and follow the trends that you've seen in the past. And this is a good example here. Let's say that we are considering all patients under the 70 kilo range. The dispensing will look like this. In this specific example, it was bevacizumab. We have 400 milligram once, and we dispense 3 times 100 milligram. And as you can see, the risky situation is that if the patient is weighing 80 kilo, he won't get the same amount of kits. So you might come with, in this case, an overestimation of 100 milligram kits and underestimation of the 400 milligram kits. So that's the whole balance between using the data, and you see here that's the same assumption, and choosing to cover it in the most efficient way for your accuracy, for your forecast to be as accurate as you can with the information you have. You can learn how to extrapolate from averages to distributions, and we have a specific workshop for that. Actually, a most advanced workshop in which you learn tips to extrapolate high-level data into more detailed information. If you're interested, please go ahead, and we'll follow up.
Thank you, Audrey. So here, the different example that we saw will allow you to have a good patient demand forecast. We already saw that it was necessary to collect the right data, but also to use it properly and sometimes to go more in the details. But to have a really global forecast, you also need to add some elements related to the supply chain. And these assumptions, we observe that sometimes they are really overlooked because you need to have a system that is able to integrate this kind of assumptions to have a good forecast. So here we will show you also other examples of assumptions that are not always considered in the forecast. And the objective is to show you that finally, depending on the value that you will have for these parameters, the forecast could be totally different. To take a first example, we have the drug shelf life. So we know that the shelf life can be really a limit and a blocker in a trial if you have a trial with a short drug shelf life. Let's imagine that we have this example with a remaining shelf life of 10 months in your trial, and you optimize finally all your IMP release plan based on this shelf life of 10 months. If now you receive the information that finally, instead to have 10 months, you will have 12 months. So just 2 additional months of shelf life that will be available. The question will be finally, what is your decision and what do you do? Do you decide to keep the same average? Do you decide to reduce this average by 10%, 30%, 50%? That's quite difficult to obtain. And in general, a lot of different systems can be really limited because to make this analysis, you don't have the possibility to test different scenarios. When you use a system, a stochastic system, as we have at Inside, you have this possibility to integrate this information and to observe the difference. In this specific case and this specific trial, it was possible to decrease a lot the average, to reduce the risk and to reduce the cost. Even if here the numbers are not so really important to be compared because it's really specific to this trial, the message is clearly that yes, the shelf life can have an impact on your forecast. You will not have to plan the same number of kits to release if you are in a situation with 10 months of remaining shelf life or 12 months of remaining shelf life. So it's also a good way to test potentially the limits of the system that you are currently using. Another example is about the shipment lead time. What we observe in a lot of different companies is that you have the information for the global average. So you will add extra kits to the demand from your patients, and this average is a global value that will be used all along the trial. But depending on the shipment lead time that you will have, and so depending on the country list that you have in your trial, you can see on the left that the waste will not be the same for the different countries. In reality, you will have less waste when the shipment lead time is shorter, and you could have a high level of waste, as in Brazil in this example, when the shipment lead time is long. Why? Because you start each time with the same remaining shelf life, but a part of this kit validity will already be used during the shipments. And so finally, you have less change to consume the kits at the end if you have a long shipment lead time. So that's why this kind of analysis is also important and be able to adapt the average per country depending on the shipment lead time that you will have. Of course, this analysis can be done during the trial to be sure that you send enough kits, for example, to cover the demand. But we can also imagine to make this kind of analysis at the protocol design stage. In this case, we could make different tests, integrating different countries in your trial to see the impact of each country on your IMP release plan. And finally, to take the decision to include or not a specific country. Already at the protocol level, we already know if later you could have some difficulties because due to a long lead time, for example, you will need to have more kits, so it means that you need to have more products available. So this kind of information, the shipment lead times and the network in general, also need to be integrated in your forecasting tool to be able to obtain accurate results. Another and the last example that we wanted to share was about the IRT capabilities. All the IRT providers do not have the same capabilities. Sometimes we have this impression that it's the case, but no, they are a little bit different. It can be, for example, that for one parameter, you can define the value per visit, and for another IT provider, the same value should be defined globally. It could be also that you can define a parameter per country and not, again, globally. Sometimes it's more in terms of capabilities and functionalities that you have to have more advanced features, as, for example, dynamic buffers, mass predictions, that are maybe some topic that you already know. And depending on the IRT providers, you will not have always access to the same capabilities. To illustrate two different cases with two different IRT providers, let's imagine that we have this trial starting with a visit interval of 4 weeks, then 8 weeks, and finally 16 weeks at the end. If for your IRT provider, you only have the possibility to have a fixed do not count all along the trial, you will have to take the worst case, so the 16 weeks. If in the opposite, you have an IRT provider that allows you to have a dynamic do not count, this value will evolve also. And so at the end, you will have the possibility to reduce your production. Our message, again, is not to say take this IRT instead of another one, because there are a lot of other parameters to consider. But it's more the fact that if you don't consider the fact that your IRT can have some limits or some possibilities, again, your forecast at the end could be totally different. And so just ensure that you understand what you can do with the different IRT and that you use them as the maximum. We will now see with Audrey what are the characteristics of a good tool. So we saw what was an accurate data, how we have to use it properly, and finally some data that we not always consider in the model. So now we will see which tool we can use for that.
Indeed, and thanks. I see some questions appearing in the chat. Don't hesitate to shoot as well. It's an interesting one that we will be looking at right after this last part. So indeed, now that you know how to gather data and how to some tips and tricks to use this properly, we need indeed to look at the right forecasting tool and see what are the different value points for a forecasting tool. And that's why I just show here this slide. It's just for your information, but this is a list of all the usual value points and criterions that we recommend to look at once you're doing an RFP for a specific forecasting and planning system. So feel free to take a screenshot, and as mentioned, the slides will be shared later on. But here you have already a comprehensive list on the value points that you might want to look at when doing an RFP for a forecasting and planning system. And now if I go back to my process here, indeed, using the right tool is important. And what it has to answer is first, the ability to centralize and unify the communication between all the stakeholders that are involved, and make sure you can standardize the way you collect the assumptions and you make the process work. And that's basically linked to this second point of making sure you have a cohesive and scalable approach to all the supply planning within your organization. That's very important. And last but not least, of course, making sure you can take the most out of this tool by looking at the output of your forecast and see basically how to analyze the data, check the historical insights, and make sure you can continuously improve your forecast in the future by learning from the past and visualizing better what is happening in your trials. So these are the key points to make things work smoothly in an organization, basically.
And we have now a last question for today that will appear on the right of your screen in the pools section. And the question is finally, how often do you adapt your demand forecast, so in your companies, and planning on average? So we'll let you a few seconds to answer. You just need to click on it. Of course, there is not a good answer. It's more to explain than what is the most adapted tool depending on that. Okay, so we start to see that once a week, twice a month, we don't really have an answer for these possibilities. Indeed, we know that sometimes made a new forecast can take time, and so I guess we don't have also these values, or it can be also because finally your forecast is good enough to be able to be used during a period of time. We have a little bit more people answering once a month, what is quite already a lot, but we know that in the trials, just in 1 month, you can already have a lot of changes. So we understand this point. The classification that we do between the number of forecasts that you do per year and the tool to use is a little bit this one. So we consider that you have two possibilities: use a deterministic forecasting tool or a stochastic forecasting tool. The idea of the deterministic forecasting tool is to be able to make more frequent rerun and new forecast. And for the stochastic, based on simulation, the idea is to have a forecast that can be used during a longer period of time, so a forecast that is more robust. To be sure that you are familiar with these two concepts, we have this small slide to show you the difference that you have. So the deterministic forecasting tool on the left is this idea that you will compute the demand of the patient, and on top of it, you will add an average that you decide. So the trial manager will decide the average to apply in a trial, and this average will be used all along the trial. So this average is an input in the model. On the right, you have a stochastic tool, so based on a more complex mathematical model and some simulation. The idea of the simulation is to test a big number of what if scenario. Typically, what's happened if my recruitment is a little bit delayed? What happens if I have more or less patients who dropped in my treatment? I want to be sure to cover all these different scenarios in the short term and in the long term, and also avoid to overproduce to cover all these situations. The main advantage of the stochastic tool is that the average, in that case, in an optimized output. So it's really the best average and that you need to use depending on all the assumptions that you have in your own trial. At Inside, we consider that both approaches are correct, but each trial, depending on the characteristic of the trial, should use one of these two tools. For the deterministic forecasting tool, it can be used for all the trials without particular challenges. So I'm quite sure that you have in your company some trials for which you already know how they will evolve. In general, you don't have too many specificities, it's not too complex. And so use this kind of deterministic forecasting tool will allow you to have a good option. And finally, you have this possibility to make a new forecast more often, depending on when you receive new assumption or update that could have an impact on your forecast. Due to that, it means that you will have a more event-responsive tool, and you will adapt your forecast every month, every 2 months. On the right, you have the simulation, the stochastic tool, and that's what we recommend for the most complex trial or the most expensive trial. Most complex can mean because you have some titrations, because you have expensive products, or because you have some field specificities are for the oncological trial. We will now make a short conclusion of what we saw during this webinar. So first of all, we add the prerequisite for the data accuracy, so the quantities, the timing, geographically, and some robustness. And we also show you that it was necessary to be able to add also elements from the supply chain in your forecast to have an accurate values. In terms of tools, so if now we make the link between the data that we want to collect and to use and the different tools, you can see that you could have an Excel. It's, to be honest, a tool that is really used by a lot of pharma companies, but it's not a tool done for that. And so it will, the accuracy of the forecast will really depend on the experience of the users. And it could be quite risky because when you want to make some tests or to test scenario, you don't have this flexibility. At Insight, we have then 2 specific tools. Lighthouse, which use the deterministic approach, and that will be good enough for all the trial for which you can define and optimize the overage that you want to use. And we have also the supply app based on the stochastic model that will allow you to have some simulations. And this model will more be used for complex trial or expensive one. In any case, if you want to compare your own system to another one, you need to be sure that the model, you have the possibility to model the trial and the data accurately in your system, all the data that we show you before. You also need to be able to adapt the forecast based on the data available. That you will also avoid some manual and computational error. That's why we clearly don't recommend Excel, because manual error can happen really fast. And at the end, it's asked to save time for you, reduce your stress because you need to be confident in this kind of model. And also allow process standardization, because the same model can be used by all your colleagues, all the companies, and so you can compare the result between different trials and speak the same language in your companies.
Yeah, those 5 points at the bottom are really important for how you can actually leverage what you're doing today to make better decisions moving forward and improve your accuracy. Thomas, Audrey, thank you very much for your presentation today. It was very insightful. I hope everyone got as much out of it as I did. And we're looking forward to continuing this conversation. We'd like to conclude with any questions from the group, and I'm happy to field some as the chat moves back to private mode, or public mode, excuse me. And as we wait for more questions, maybe we can address a few that we had earlier. So Thomas and Audrey, I'll read the question aloud, and then you'll decide who would like to address this. First question we have: if I'm looking to ensure reliable forecasts and avoid shortages at sites, while also keeping in mind to limit the kit wastage, when the resupply relies on shelf life of extension plan with potential risks of delays to obtain stability data, how would I go about doing so?
Yes, so thank you for the question. I think here the main difficulty that you face is the fact that a model of shelf life extension is not always easy. So due to the fact that you have the shelf life extension, it could create some risk in your sites, because you first need to receive the new, to be sure to have enough kits on site during this period of time. So to be transparent with you, when we have this shelf life extension, in our model, we have the possibility to model it in our system. And so we can make different tests to be sure that we will not have a shortage at any moment in the trial. What we can do is typically to test the date at which you should have these new kits that will be available. And we can also test finally the flexibility that you have. So if the shelf life takes more time than expected, or if you have less kits at the end with the new shelf life, when will appear the risk? And so it means that you can already take some decision in advance and finally never have this risk in reality, because you already know all the dates, all the quantity that you need to cover this period of time. That is indeed a risky period.
Maybe one additional question, and then we'll continue to leave this open for a few minutes as we can allow some more final notes. If I have a very complex study and I'm looking at a stochastic forecasting option, am I better off doing this ahead of time before the study has started? Or what would be the impact if my study's already begun?
Yeah, that's indeed a good one. How to choose and when do we have to take some actions? And indeed, that's what we observed in the past. The earlier we are taking actions, the better it is. That's why you saw here, I don't know how easy it will be to go through this slide, but remember in the drivers of inaccuracy and inefficiencies, we had the trial design as well. And that's where you will see that the highest part is covered here. So there are plenty of things to test and to do to make sure we are getting out the most of the forecast and make sure we take the right decision from the beginning. And indeed, looking at the deterministic and stochastic approach, it's true that with the stochastic approach, we will be considering some variability. And that's also the best way to test some scenarios and make sure you take the best decision even before the trial starts. And that's where you will see the most impactful change in terms of waste and risk. Is just taking the problem from the roots and make sure you take it good enough that fit.
Yeah, that's a great response, Audrey. I think those what-if scenarios and being able to scenario plan for that variability throughout the life cycle of a study can be so valuable for us. We do have just about a minute remaining, so the remaining questions we'll address via email directly upon conclusion of the webinar. In addition, as we mentioned, we'll send a copy of the recording from today's session as well as the slides that we've gone through today. Please let us know if there's any questions or comments. We'd love your feedback as well. But thank you very much for all who participated today. We appreciate you being here and looking to be more innovative in clinical supply planning and forecasting. Thanks, Audrey. Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate your time.